On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot 5 times in the back outside the Dakota building in New York City. Just a few hours earlier, he had signed an album for the very man who would later kill him. The murder shocked the entire world. Millions mourned a symbol of peace. The man who wrote Imagine, a song about a world without war. But there was something the public rarely heard. John Lennon once admitted that in his younger years he lived with rage, violence, and wounds that never fully healed. So how did a man carrying so much darkness end up writing the most peaceful song of the century? In 1971, John Lennon released a song that would travel far beyond his own lifetime. It was called Imagine. Within a few years, the song was heard across the world, on radios, in concert halls, during political protests, and at moments of mourning. Decades later, it would still be ranked among the greatest songs ever written. A simple piano melody carrying a radical idea. A world without war, borders, religion, or the divisions that had shaped the 20th century. By that point, Lennon was no longer just a former member of the Beatles, the band that had already sold hundreds of millions of records and reshaped modern music. He had become something larger in the public imagination, a cultural voice for peace, rebellion, and possibility. But Lennon himself understood the strange contradiction behind that image. Because long before millions of people began singing Imagine, he had spent years confronting something very different inside his own life. In interviews later on, Lennon admitted that as a young man he had often been jealous, explosive, and sometimes violent, carrying a deep anger he did not fully understand. The truth is that the man who wrote one of the most peaceful songs in history had spent much of his life trying to escape a storm that started long before fame, back in Liverpool, with a childhood shaped by loss, separation, and a wound that never completely healed. John Winston Lennon was born on October 9, 1940, in Liverpool, England. The country was in the middle of World War II, and Liverpool was one of the cities most frequently bombed by German air raids. Lennon entered the world during the chaos of war, a detail that would later feel almost symbolic, because conflict, in many different forms, seemed to follow him throughout his life. But the real turbulence in Lennon's childhood did not come from the war outside. It came from inside his own family. His father, Alfred Lennon, was a merchant seaman who spent long periods away at sea. When Lennon was still very young, Alfred disappeared from his life almost completely. His mother, Julia Lennon, was warm, funny, and full of life, but she struggled to provide a stable home. Eventually, a difficult decision was made. John would not grow up with his mother. Instead, he was raised by his strict and practical Aunt Mimi Smith in a modest house on Menlove Avenue. Aunt Mimi believed strongly in discipline, order, and realistic expectations. She often reminded Lennon that music was not a real career. According to family stories, when Lennon became obsessed with guitars and rock and roll, Mimi once told him bluntly, "The guitar's fine, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." For Lennon, childhood became a strange emotional split between two worlds. With Aunt Mimi there was stability, but also distance and control. With his mother Julia, whom he would visit occasionally, there was warmth, laughter, and music. Julia played the banjo and introduced Lennon to the early sound of American rock and roll. She taught him simple chords, played records for him, and encouraged his curiosity about music. In those moments, Lennon discovered something that felt powerful. Music could turn loneliness into expression, but that fragile connection was suddenly destroyed. On July 15, 1958, when Lennon was 17 years old, his mother Julia was struck and killed by a car driven by an off-duty police officer. The accident happened close to Aunt Mimi's house. The news reached Lennon suddenly, without warning. The shock was devastating. Lennon would later say that losing his mother this way left a wound that never truly healed. It was the second time he felt abandoned by a parent, and this time there was no possibility of reconciliation. Friends who knew Lennon during his teenage years remembered that something changed in him after that moment. The humor and sharp were still there, but beneath them was a deeper anger. At school, Lennon was intelligent, creative, and rebellious. Teachers often described him as disruptive but gifted. He loved drawing cartoons and writing absurd short stories filled with dark humor. Authority figures frustrated him, and he rarely hid his opinions. Rules felt pointless to him, and he often challenged them openly. Yet even in those chaotic years, music was becoming more than a hobby. The mid-1950s brought the explosive arrival of rock and roll from the United States. Artists like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard were transforming youth culture across Europe. For teenagers in Liverpool, this music felt electric, rebellious, and completely different from anything their parents had known. For Lennon, it felt like liberation. He began teaching himself guitar and forming small skiffle groups with school friends. In 1956, he created a band called the Quarrymen, named after his school, Quarry Bank High School. At first, they were just another amateur group, playing simple songs at local events and parties. But something inside Lennon was already pushing forward. He had a natural stage presence, sarcastic, confident, and unpredictable. He could be funny, charming, and provocative all at once. Even in those early performances, Lennon seemed to understand that music was not just about sound. It was about personality. It was about attitude. And perhaps most importantly, it was about turning inner chaos into something that could be heard by the world. In 1957, during a small summer church festival performance with the Quarrymen, Lennon met a younger musician who would change everything, Paul McCartney. That meeting would eventually lead to the creation of the Beatles, the most influential band of the 20th century. But at that moment, none of that future existed yet. There was only a 17-year-old boy from Liverpool, carrying grief, anger, humor, and raw talent, trying to find a place where his voice could finally be heard. The question was simple. What would happen when that voice suddenly reached the entire world? The meeting between John Lennon and Paul McCartney in 1957 did not look historic at first. It happened at a small church festival in Liverpool where Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, was performing on a temporary outdoor stage. McCartney, only 15 at the time, watched in the crowd and was later introduced to Lennon by a mutual friend. Someone handed him a guitar, and he played a few songs. Lennon noticed immediately that the younger boy could tune a guitar properly and knew the lyrics to several American rock songs by heart. That was enough to make an impression. Lennon invited him to join the band soon after. From the beginning, the partnership between Lennon and McCartney was unusual. Both had grown up with a similar emotional scar. Each had lost his mother during adolescence. That shared experience created an unspoken connection between them. Their personalities were different, even opposite in many ways. Lennon was sharp, rebellious, and unpredictable. McCartney was disciplined, melodic, and naturally organized. But together they formed a creative balance that would become legendary. Over the next few years, the Quarrymen slowly evolved into something new. McCartney introduced his younger friend George Harrison, whose precise guitar playing impressed Lennon despite the age difference. By 1960, the group had adopted a new name, the Beatles. At first, they were still far from famous. Liverpool's music scene was crowded with young bands trying to imitate American rock and rhythm and blues. To survive, the Beatles took a difficult but crucial step. They accepted a series of contracts to perform in the club district of Hamburg, Germany. These shows were long, exhausting, and sometimes chaotic. Bands were expected to play for hours each night, often in noisy clubs filled with sailors, tourists, and late-night crowds. For the Beatles, Hamburg became a training ground. Night after night, they played rock covers, improvising and experimenting with energy and stage presence. Lennon thrived in that environment. He developed a sarcastic humor and fearless confidence that would later define his public image. But the lifestyle also exposed the band to a rough world of nightlife, alcohol, and little sleep. Those early years hardened them, both musically and personally. By the time they returned to Liverpool, something had changed. Their performances were sharper, louder, and more confident than before. Local audiences began to notice. In 1961, a record store owner named Brian Epstein saw them perform at the Cavern Club. Epstein believed the band had enormous potential and offered to become their manager. He refined their image, replaced their leather jackets with tailored suits, and pushed relentlessly for a recording contract. That effort paid off in 1962, when the Beatles signed with EMI Records under producer George Martin. Their first single, Love Me Do, reached the British charts. Soon after, Please Please Me became their first major hit. From that point forward, their rise was almost unstoppable. Each new release climbed higher, each concert attracted larger crowds, and the band's identity began spreading beyond Liverpool. At the center of this momentum stood Lennon. He was often seen as a leader during those early years, the one with the strongest personality and the sharpest wit. On stage, he projected confidence, humor, and a rebellious charm that connected easily with audiences. Off stage, however, the same intensity could turn into impatience or anger. Friends from those years recalled that Lennon sometimes struggled with sudden mood swings. The success of the band brought excitement, but it also brought pressure. For Lennon, music had started as a private escape from childhood wounds. Now it was becoming a global phenomenon. By 1963, the Beatles were dominating British charts. A year later, they would conquer the United States and trigger a cultural explosion later called Beatlemania. Screaming crowds, international tours, television appearances, and non-stop media attention turned four young musicians from Liverpool into the most recognizable band on the planet. But as the world celebrated the rise of the Beatles, Lennon's internal life remained complicated. The boy who had once used music to process loss and anger was now expected to live permanently under the brightest spotlight in modern entertainment. The fame came faster than anyone could understand, and it transformed every aspect of the band's lives. What had begun as a group of teenagers playing loud songs in Liverpool clubs was about to become a global force that would reshape music, culture, and youth identity. And John Lennon, still carrying the same unresolved emotions from his childhood, was about to find himself at the very center of it all. The question now was no longer whether the Beatles would become famous. It was what that level of fame would do to John Lennon himself. By 1964, the Beatles were no longer just a successful British band. They had become a global phenomenon. When the group arrived in the United States for their first major television appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, more than 73 million viewers watched the broadcast. At that moment, nearly half of the American population was tuned in. The performance triggered a cultural eruption that the media quickly named Beatlemania. From that point forward, the scale of the band's fame became almost impossible to measure. Airports filled with screaming fans. Hotels were surrounded by crowds that sometimes waited for hours just to catch a glimpse of the band. Concert halls and stadiums sold out within minutes. At many shows, the noise of the audience was so overwhelming that the band members could barely hear their own instruments. In the center of this storm stood John Lennon. Alongside Paul McCartney, Lennon formed one of the most productive songwriting partnerships in modern music history. Their songs were not only popular, they were changing the structure of pop music itself. Early hits like She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Help made the band international superstars. But as the decade progressed, Lennon's songwriting became more introspective and experimental. Songs like Norwegian Wood, Strawberry Fields Forever, and A Day in the Life pushed the boundaries of what popular music could express. The Beatles were no longer simply writing love songs. They were experimenting with studio technology, storytelling, and emotional complexity in ways that influenced an entire generation of musicians. Yet the brighter the spotlight became, the more difficult it was for Lennon to live inside it. Touring had turned into an exhausting cycle of travel, performances, interviews, and media appearances. The band members lived under constant observation. Every word they said could become a headline. Every decision they made was analyzed by journalists and fans alike. In 1966, that pressure exploded into a global controversy. During an interview with a British newspaper, Lennon made an offhand remark while discussing the cultural influence of the Beatles. He said that the band had become more popular than Jesus. The comment was meant as an observation about changing youth culture, but when the quote reached the United States, it triggered an immediate backlash. Religious groups organized protests. Beatles records were burned publicly in several American cities. Radio stations banned their music. The band received threats, and their upcoming tours became security nightmares. For Lennon, the experience was deeply unsettling. He had always been outspoken, sometimes sarcastic, but the scale of the reaction showed him something new. Global fame could turn a single sentence into a crisis overnight. The controversy forced Lennon to publicly apologize, something he rarely did. Behind the scenes, another transformation was taking place. Lennon had begun experimenting with LSD and psychedelic drugs, part of a broader cultural shift happening in the 1960s. Like many artists of that era, he believed these experiences might expand creativity and perception. For a time, They influenced the band's music and visual style, contributing to albums such as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But the deeper Lennon explored his own consciousness, the more he began questioning everything around him: fame, identity, and even the structure of the Beatles themselves. In 1966, the band made a radical decision. They stopped touring completely. For the first time since becoming famous, the Beatles would focus entirely on studio recording rather than live performances. The move allowed them to experiment creatively, but also meant the four members were spending more time inside the studio, a space where personal differences became harder to ignore. At the same time, Lennon's personal life was about to change dramatically. That same year, at a small art gallery exhibition in London, Lennon met a Japanese avant-garde artist named Yoko Ono. Their meeting was brief, but it left an impression on both of them. Ono's conceptual art and unconventional thinking fascinated Lennon. She approached creativity from a completely different angle than the world of pop music he had been living in. Within a few years, their relationship would become one of the most talked about partnerships in modern cultural history. But at the moment they first met, the Beatles were still at the peak of their power. They were producing groundbreaking music, dominating global charts, and redefining popular culture. From the outside, it looked like an unstoppable success story. Yet inside the band, and inside John Lennon himself, the foundations were beginning to shift. The fame that had once felt thrilling was starting to feel like a cage. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were still the most influential band in the world. But internally, the group was beginning to fracture. The pressure of fame, years of relentless work, and growing artistic differences were slowly pulling the four members in separate directions. At the center of that shift was John Lennon, whose life and identity were changing faster than anyone around him fully understood. The turning point came through his relationship with Yoko Ono. Lennon and Ono first met in 1966 at an avant-garde art exhibition in London. Ono's work was conceptual, abstract, and often deliberately unconventional. To many observers, it seemed strange or confusing, but Lennon saw something different in it. He recognized the same rebellious spirit that had drawn him to rock and roll years earlier. Ono's art questioned authority, tradition, and expectation, ideas that resonated deeply with Lennon at a moment when he was beginning to question the structure of his own life. Their connection quickly became intense. By 1968, Lennon and Ono were spending nearly all their time together. She accompanied him to recording sessions, studio meetings, and private conversations that had traditionally belonged only to the four members of the Beatles. For the rest of the band, this sudden presence felt disruptive. The Beatles had always functioned as a closed circle. Ono's involvement broke that unwritten rule, but the deeper transformation was happening inside Lennon himself. For years, he'd been living under the identity of John Lennon the Beatle. The world saw him as part of a unified band, a cultural symbol, and a public figure whose words and actions carried enormous influence. Yet, privately, Lennon had begun to feel that the role no longer fit him. The music he wanted to make was becoming more personal, more political, and sometimes more confrontational than what the band was comfortable releasing together. At the same time, Lennon was confronting parts of his own past that he had rarely spoken about publicly. In later interviews, he admitted that during his younger years, he had sometimes acted violently in relationships and struggled with jealousy and anger. Fame had not erased those emotions. In many ways, it had intensified them. The constant attention and expectations and pressures of global celebrity created a psychological environment where personal flaws became harder to hide. During this period, Lennon also began experimenting with different forms of therapy and self-reflection. One of the most influential was primal therapy, a controversial psychological method that encouraged patients to revisit and release childhood trauma. For Lennon, the therapy reopened memories of abandonment, grief, and unresolved anger connected to his parents. Those experiences deeply influenced his music. In 1970, Lennon released his first major solo album, John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band. The songs were stark, raw, and emotionally exposed. Tracks like Mother directly addressed the pain he felt after losing his parents. The lyrics were not polished pop poetry. They sounded like confessions. Critics and listeners were shocked by how openly Lennon was confronting his past. Meanwhile, the internal structure of the Beatles was collapsing. Creative disagreements grew sharper with each recording session. Financial conflicts and management disputes added more tension. Each member had begun pursuing individual projects outside the band. What had once been a tight creative partnership was slowly becoming four separate artistic paths, sharing the same studio. By 1970, the separation became official. The Beatles, the band that had transformed global music in less than a decade, came to an end. For millions of fans around the world, the breakup felt almost unimaginable. But for Lennon, it was both painful and liberating. He was no longer bound to the identity that had defined his entire adult life. At the same time, the loss of that structure left him facing a difficult question. Who was he without the Beatles? In the early 1970s, Lennon began channeling his energy into activism as much as music. Together with Yoko Ono, he staged a series of highly visible protests against the Vietnam War. The most famous was a bed-in for peace in 1969, where the couple spent several days in a hotel bed while inviting journalists to discuss peace and anti-war politics. The event was unusual, even absurd to some observers, but it captured media attention around the world. Lennon understood something about publicity. A symbolic gesture could reach millions of people faster than a traditional speech or political rally. His activism soon attracted the attention of political authorities as well. In the United States, the administration of President Richard Nixon viewed Lennon as a potential influence on young voters during a time of widespread anti-war protest. According to later documents released by the FBI, Lennon's public statements and planned concerts were monitored closely. The government even attempted to deport him by revoking his immigration status, triggering a long legal battle that lasted several years. For Lennon, the conflict reinforced the sense that music and politics were inseparable. It was during this turbulent period that he wrote Imagine. Released in 1971, the song presented a simple but radical vision of a world without national borders, religious divisions, or wars. The lyrics were direct, almost conversational. There were no complex metaphors or poetic puzzles, just a quiet invitation to picture a different kind of world. The song spread rapidly across cultures and generations. It became one of the most recognized peace anthems in modern history. Yet the irony was impossible to ignore. The man writing these words about unity and peace had spent much of his life wrestling with anger, resentment, and personal conflict. Lennon himself acknowledged that contradiction openly. In interviews, he explained that the song represented an aspiration rather than a description of reality. It was not the world as it existed. It was the world he wished could exist. And perhaps more importantly, it was the kind of peace he was still searching for within himself. But Lennon's journey toward that peace was far from complete, because in the years that followed, even his relationship with Yoko Ono would face its own period of instability and chaos, a chapter that would later be remembered as one of the strangest phases of his life. By the early 1970s, John Lennon had already lived several different lives. He had been a rebellious teenager from Liverpool, the voice of the most famous band on the planet, and the outspoken activist challenging political power during the Vietnam War. Yet behind all of those identities, Lennon was still searching for something more personal, a sense of peace that fame and ideology had never fully delivered. Ironically, that search became more complicated before it became clearer. In 1973, Lennon and Yoko Ono separated for a period that later became known as his Lost Weekend. Despite the name, it lasted nearly 18 months. During this time, Lennon moved to Los Angeles, surrounded by musicians, actors, and a constant nightlife culture. The period was chaotic. Lennon drank heavily, appeared in several public incidents, and drifted through a series of recording sessions and late-night gatherings that felt very different from the disciplined studio work of his Beatles years. Yet the Lost Weekend was not purely destructive. During those months, Lennon continued making music, collaborating with artists such as Elton John, and producing songs that still carried his unmistakable voice and perspective. One of the most memorable moments came in 1974, when Lennon joined Elton John on stage at Madison Square Garden. It would become Lennon's last major live performance in front of a large audience. Shortly after that concert, another turning point arrived. Lennon reconciled with Yoko Ono. The reunion marked the beginning of a quieter phase in his life. In October 1975, their son Sean Lennon was born. For Lennon, The experience of becoming a father again reshaped his priorities in ways that fame never had. He made a decision that surprised the music world. Lennon stepped away from his career. For nearly 5 years, he released no major new albums and rarely appeared in public. Instead of touring, recording, or giving interviews, Lennon devoted his time to raising his son and managing daily life at home in New York. He cooked meals, walked through Central Park, and spent long hours caring for Sean while Yoko Ono focused on business matters. To many observers, it seemed almost unbelievable. One of the most famous musicians on earth had quietly disappeared from the spotlight. But Lennon later described these years as some of the most meaningful in his life. For the first time since childhood, he was living outside the relentless pressure of global fame. There were no screaming crowds waiting outside hotels, no endless interviews, no expectations to produce the next cultural revolution. There was only family life. During those years, Lennon reflected deeply on his past, the anger he had carried, the mistakes he had admitted, and the strange journey from Liverpool teenager to global icon. The distance from public life allowed him to see his story differently. He began to think less about changing the entire world and more about understanding himself. In 1980, Lennon finally felt ready to return to music. Together with Yoko Ono, he began recording a new album titled Double Fantasy. The project reflected the changes in his life. Instead of political protest or emotional confession, many of the songs focus on relationships, family, and the experience of growing older. It sounded calmer, more reflective. The world was about to hear a different John Lennon, one who seemed to have moved beyond the anger that had defined much of his earlier life. But just as that new chapter was beginning, events were already moving toward a moment that no one could have predicted. And the piece Lennon had spent his life searching for would soon become something far more complicated. In 1980, after nearly 5 years away from the music industry, John Lennon returned with a new project that surprised many listeners. The album was called Double Fantasy, a collaboration between Lennon and Yoko Ono. Unlike the political songs and raw emotional confessions that had marked his earlier solo work, this album reflected something quieter and more mature. The lyrics spoke about marriage, family life, responsibility, and the strange process of growing older after living inside decades of fame. For Lennon, the album represented a personal reset. He described it not as a comeback, but as the beginning of a new chapter. After years of searching through music, activism, therapy, and personal reflection, Lennon believed he had finally reached a place where his life felt balanced. Interviews from that period show a calmer man, more thoughtful about the past, and less interested in confrontation than he had been during the intense political years of the early 1970s. The public response to his return was filled with curiosity and excitement. Lennon had been silent for half a decade, and many people were eager to see what direction his music would take next. Radio stations began playing songs from a new album, and the cultural conversation around Lennon started to grow again. But the new beginning lasted only a few weeks. On the evening of December 8, 1980, John Lennon and Yoko Ono returned to their home at the Dakota building in New York City after a day of recording sessions. As Lennon walked toward the entrance, a man standing near the doorway fired 5 shots from a revolver. 4 of the bullets struck Lennon in the back. The attacker was a 25-year-old man named Mark David Chapman. Just hours earlier that same day, Chapman had approached Lennon outside the Dakota and asked him to sign a copy of the Double Fantasy album. Lennon had calmly written his autograph and handed the record back. That photograph, Lennon signing the album for the man who would later kill him, would become one of the most haunting images in modern cultural history. Lennon was rushed to a nearby hospital, but was pronounced dead shortly afterward. He was 40 years old. The news spread across the world within hours. In cities across Europe, America, and Asia, radio stations interrupted their programming to report the story. Fans gathered in public squares and outside the Dakota building. Many held candles. Others simply stood in silence. It felt as if a voice that had defined an entire generation had suddenly disappeared. Yet Lennon's music did not disappear with him. Songs like Imagine, Give Peace a Chance, and many of his Beatles compositions continue to circulate across decades, new generations discovering them long after the events that inspired them had passed. In death, John Lennon became more than a musician. He became a symbol, not just of peace, but the complicated human journey behind the search for it. John Lennon's story is often remembered through the image of a round pair of glasses and a quiet piano melody. But the truth of his life was far more complicated than the symbol that remained after his death. Lennon was not a perfect messenger of peace. He was a man who openly admitted that much of his early life had been shaped by anger, jealousy, and confusion. The boy from Liverpool who lost his mother at 17 carried that wound into adulthood, into fame, and into relationships that sometimes struggled under the weight of his emotions. And yet, perhaps that is exactly why his music continues to resonate decades later. When Lennon wrote, "Imagine," he was not describing a world that already existed. He was describing a world he wished could exist, a world without the divisions and conflicts that had shaped his own life. The song was less a political manifesto than a personal hope, an attempt to turn private pain into something universal. After his death, Lennon's legacy grew in ways that few artists experience. His songs became part of global culture, performed at memorials, political events, and moments of collective reflection. New generations who had never seen the Beatles live still discovered his voice through recordings that carried both idealism and vulnerability. Perhaps the most enduring truth about John Lennon is this: the man who sang about peace was never free from conflict within himself, but he kept searching for that peace anyway. And in that search, imperfect, human, and unfinished, millions of people found something they recognized in their own lives.